The Background by Saki, H. Munro. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London. "That woman's art jargon tires me," said Clovis to his journalist friend. "She's so fond of talking of certain pictures as growing on one, as though they were a sort of fungus." "That reminds me," said the journalist, "of the story of Henri Deplis. Have I ever told it you?" Clovis shook his head. Henri Deplis was by birth a native of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. On maturer reflection he became a commercial traveller. His business activities frequently took him beyond the limits of the Grand Duchy, and he was stopping in a small town in northern Italy when news reached him from home that a legacy from a distant and deceased relative had fallen to his share. It was not a large legacy, even from the modest standpoint of Henri Deplis, but it impelled him towards some seemingly harmless extravagances. In particular, it led him to patronize local art as represented by the tattoo needles of Signor Andreas Pincini. Signor Pincini was, perhaps, the most brilliant master of tattoo craft that Italy had ever known, but his circumstances were decidedly impoverished, and for the sum of 600 francs he gladly undertook to cover his client's back from the collarbone down to the waistline with a glowing representation of the fall of Icarus. The design, when finally developed, was a slight disappointment to Monsieur Deplis, who had suspected Lecarus of being a fortress taken by Wallenstein in the 30 Years' War, but he was more than satisfied with the execution of the work, which was acclaimed by all who had the privilege of seeing it as Pincini's masterpiece. It was his greatest effort and his last. Without even waiting to be paid, the illustrious craftsman departed this life and was buried under an ornate tombstone, whose winged cherubs would have afforded singularly little scope for the exercise of his favourite art. There remained, however, the widow Pincini, to whom the 600 francs were due, and thereupon arose the great crisis in the life of Henri Deplis, traveller of commerce. The legacy, under the stress of numerous little calls on its substance, had dwindled to very insignificant proportions, and when a pressing wine bill and sundry other current accounts had been paid, there remained little more than 430 francs to offer to the widow. The lady was properly indignant, not wholly, as she volubly explained, on account of the suggested writing off of 170 francs, but also at the attempt to depreciate the value of her late husband's acknowledged masterpiece. In a week's time, Deplis was obliged to reduce his offer to 405 francs, which circumstance fanned the widow's indignation into a fury. She cancelled the sale of the work of art, and a few days later Deplis learned with a sense of consternation that she had presented it to the municipality of Bergamo, which had gratefully accepted it. He left the neighbourhood as unobtrusively as possible, and was genuinely relieved when his business commands took him to Rome, where he hoped his identity and that of the famous picture might be lost sight of. But he bore on his back the burden of the dead man's genius. On presenting himself one day in the steaming corridor of a vapour bath, he was at once hustled back into his clothes by the proprietor, who was a North Italian, and who emphatically refused to allow the celebrated fall of Icarus to be publicly on view without the permission of the municipality of Bergamo. Public interest and official vigilance increased as the matter became more widely known, and Deplis was unable to take a simple dip in the sea or river on the hottest afternoon unless clothed up to the collarbone in a substantial bathing garment. Later on, the authorities of Bergamo conceived the idea that salt water might be injurious to the masterpiece, and a perpetual injunction was obtained which debarred the muchly harassed commercial traveller from sea-bathing under any circumstances. Altogether, he was fervently thankful when his firm of employers found him a new range of activities in the neighbourhood of Bordeaux. His thankfulness, however, ceased abruptly at the Franco-Italian frontier. An imposing array of official force barred his departure, and he was sternly reminded of the stringent law which forbids the exportation of Italian works of art. A diplomatic parley ensued between the Luxembourgian and Italian governments, and at one time the European situation became overcast with the possibilities of trouble. But the Italian government stood firm. It declined to concern itself in the least with the fortunes or even the existence of Henri Deplis, commercial traveller, but was immovable in its decision that the fall of Icarus by the late Pincini, Andreas, at present the property of the municipality of Bergamo, should not leave the country. The excitement died down in time, but the unfortunate Deplis, who was of a constitutionally retiring disposition, found himself a few months later once more the storm centre of a furious controversy. A certain German art expert who had obtained from the municipality of Bergamo permission to inspect the famous masterpiece declared it to be a spurious Pincini, probably the work of some pupil whom he had employed in his declining years. The evidence of Deplis on the subject was obviously worthless, as he had been under the influence of the customary narcotics during the long process of pricking in the design. The editor of an Italian art journal refuted the contentions of the German expert and undertook to prove that his private life did not conform to any modern standard of decency. The whole of Italy and Germany were drawn into the dispute, and the rest of Europe was soon involved in the quarrel. There were stormy scenes in the Spanish Parliament, and the University of Copenhagen bestowed a gold medal on the German expert, afterwards sending a commission to examine his proofs on the spot, while two Polish schoolboys in Paris committed suicide to show what they thought of the matter. Meanwhile, the unhappy human background fared no better than before, and it was not surprising that he drifted into the ranks of Italian anarchists. 4 times at least he was escorted to the frontier as a dangerous and undesirable foreigner, but he was always brought back as the fall of Icarus, attributed to Pincini Andreas, early 20th century. And then one day at an anarchist congress at Genoa, a fellow worker in the heat of debate broke a phial full of corrosive liquid over his back. The red shirt that he was wearing mitigated the effects, but the Icarus was ruined beyond recognition. His assailant was severely reprimanded for assaulting a fellow anarchist and received 7 years' imprisonment for the defacing of a national art treasure. As soon as he was able to leave the hospital, Henri Deplis was put across the frontier as an undesirable alien. In the quieter streets of Paris, especially in the neighbourhood of the Ministry of Fine Arts, you may sometimes meet a depressed, anxious-looking man who, if you pass him the time of day, will answer you with a slight Luxembourgian accent. He nurses the illusion that he is one of the lost arms of the Venus de Milo, and hopes that the French government may be persuaded to buy him. On all other subjects, I believe, he is tolerably sane. End of The Background by Saki. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London. The Chaplet by H. Monroe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London. A strange stillness hung over the restaurant. It was one of those rare moments when the orchestra was not discoursing the strains of the Ice Cream Sailor Waltz. "Did I ever tell you," asked Clovis to his friend, "the tragedy of music at mealtimes?" It was a gala evening at the Grand Sabaris Hotel, and a special dinner was being served in the Amethyst Dining Hall. The Amethyst Dining Hall had almost a European reputation, especially with that section of Europe which is historically identified with the Jordan Valley. Its cooking was beyond reproach, and its orchestra was sufficiently highly salaried to be above criticism. Thither came in shoals the intensely musical and the almost intensely musical, who are very many, and in still greater numbers the merely musical, who know how Tchaikovsky's name is pronounced and can recognize several of Chopin's nocturnes, if you give them due warning. These eat in the nervous, detached manner of roebuck feeding in the open, and keep anxious ears cocked towards the orchestra for the first hint of a recognizable melody. "Ah, yes, Pagliacci," they murmur, as the opening strains follow hot upon the soup, and if no contradiction is forthcoming from any better informed quarter, they break forth into subdued humming by way of supplementing the efforts of the musicians. Sometimes the melody starts on level terms with the soup, in which case the banqueteers contrive somehow to hum between the spoonfuls. The facial expression of enthusiasts who are punctuating pottage Saint-Germain with Pagliacci is not beautiful, but it should be seen by those who are bent on observing all sides of life. One cannot discount the unpleasant things of this world merely by looking the other way. In addition to the aforementioned types, the restaurant was patronized by a fair sprinkling of the absolutely non-musical. Their presence in the dining hall could only be explained on the supposition that they had come there to dine. The earlier stages of the dinner had worn off. The wine lists had been consulted, by some with the blank embarrassment of a schoolboy suddenly called on to locate a minor prophet in the tangled hinterland of the Old Testament, by others with the severe scrutiny which suggests that they had visited most of the higher-priced wines in their own homes and probed their family weaknesses. The diners who chose their wine in the latter fashion always gave their orders in a penetrating voice, with a plentiful garnishing of stage directions. By insisting on having your bottle pointing to the north when the cork is being drawn and calling the waiter Max, you may induce an impression on your guests which hours of laboured boasting might be powerless to achieve. For this purpose, however, the guests must be chosen as carefully as the wine. Standing aside from the revellers in the shadow of a massive pillar was an interested spectator who was assuredly of the feast, and yet not in it. Monsieur Aristide Saucourt was the chef of the Grand Sabaris Hotel, and if he had an equal in his profession, he had never acknowledged the fact. In his own domain he was a potentate, hedged around with the cold brutality that genius expects rather than excuses in her children. He never forgave, and those who served him were careful that there should be little to forgive. In the outer world, the world which devoured his creations, he was an influence. How profound or how shallow an influence he never attempted to guess. It is the penalty and the safeguard of genius that it computes itself by troy weight in a world that measures by vulgar hundredweights. Once in a way the great man would be seized with a desire to watch the effect of his master efforts, just as the guiding brain of Krups might wish at a supreme moment to intrude into the firing line of an artillery duel. and such an occasion was the present. For the first time in the history of the Grand Sybaris Hotel, he was presenting to its guests the dish which he had brought to that pitch of perfection which almost amounts to scandal. Canetons à la mode d'un Belleville. In thin gilt lettering on the creamy white of the menu, how little those words conveyed to the bulk of the imperfectly educated diners, and yet how much specialized effort had been lavished, how much carefully treasured lore had been ungarnered before those 6 words could be written. In the department of the Deux Sèvres, ducklings had lived particular and beautiful lives and died in the odour of satiety to furnish the main theme of the dish, champignons, which even a purist for Saxon English would have hesitated to address as mushrooms, had contributed their languorous, atrophied bodies to the garnishing, and a sauce devised in the twilight reign of the 15th Louis had been summoned back from the imperishable past to take its part in the wonderful confection. Thus far had human effort laboured to achieve the desired result. The rest had been left to human genius, the genius of Aristide Saucourt. And now the moment had arrived for the serving of the great dish, the dish which world-weary Grand Dukes and market-obsessed money magnates counted among their happiest memories. And at the same moment something else happened. The leader of the highly salaried orchestra placed his violin caressingly against his chin, lowered his eyelids, and floated into a sea of melody. "Hark," said most of the diners, "he is playing the Chapelet." They knew it was the Chapelet because they had heard it played at luncheon and afternoon tea and at supper the night before, and had not had time to forget. "Yes, he is playing the Chapelet," they reassured one another. The general voice was unanimous on the subject. The orchestra had already played it 11 times that day, 4 times by desire and 7 times from force of habit, but the familiar strains were greeted with the rapture due to a revelation. A murmur of much humming rose from half the tables in the room, and some of the more overwrought listeners laid down knife and fork in order to be able to burst in with loud clappings at the earliest permissible moment. And the Canetons à la mode d'un Belleville? In stupefied, sickening wonder, Aristide watched them grow cold in total neglect, or suffer the almost worse indignity of perfunctory pecking and listless munching while the banqueters lavished their approval and applause on the music makers. Carl's liver and bacon with parsley sauce could hardly have figured more ignominiously in the evening's entertainment. And while the master of culinary arts leaned back against the sheltering pillar, choking with a horrible brain-searing rage that could find no outlet for its agony, the orchestra leader was bowing his acknowledgment of the hand-clappings that rose in a storm around him. Turning to his colleagues, he nodded the signal for an encore. But before the violin had been lifted anew into position, there came from the shadow of the pillow an explosive negative. "No, no, you do not play thus again." The musician turned in furious astonishment. Had he taken warning from the look in the other man's eyes, he might have acted differently, but the admiring plaudits were ringing in his ears, and he snarled out sharply, "That is for me to decide." "No, you play that never again," shouted the chef, and the next moment he had flung himself violently upon the loathed being who had supplanted him in the world's esteem. A large metal tureen, filled to the brim with steaming soup, had just been placed on a side table in readiness for a late party of diners. Before the waiting staff, all the guests had time to realize what was happening. Aristide had dragged his struggling victim up to the table and plunged his head deep down into the almost boiling contents of the tureen. At the further end of the room, the diners were still spasmodically applauding in view of an encore. Whether the leader of the orchestra died from drowning by soup, or from the shock to his professional vanity, or was scalded to death, the doctors were never wholly able to agree. Monsieur Aristide Saucourt, who now lives in complete retirement, always inclined to the drowning theory. End of The Chaplet by H. Munro. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London. The Christmas Tree and the Wedding by Fyodor M. Dostoevsky. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. The other day I saw a wedding. But no, I'd rather tell you about a Christmas tree. The wedding was superb. I liked it immensely, but the other incident was still finer. I don't know why it is that the sight of the wedding reminded me of the Christmas tree. This is the way it happened. Exactly 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was invited to a children's ball by a man high up in the business world who had his connections, his circle of acquaintances, and his intrigues. So it seemed as though the children's ball was merely a pretext for the parents to come together and discuss matters of interest to themselves quite innocently and casually. I was an outsider and, as I had no special matters to air, I was able to spend the evening independently of the others. There was another gentleman present who, like myself, had just stumbled upon this affair of domestic bliss. He was the first to attract my attention. His appearance was not that of a man of birth or high family. He was tall, rather thin, very serious, and well dressed. Apparently he had no heart for the family festivities. The instant he went off into a corner by himself, the smile disappeared from his face, and his thick dark brows knitted into a frown. He knew no one except the host, and showed every sign of being bored to death, though bravely sustaining the role of thorough enjoyment to the end. Later I learned that he was provincial, had come to the capital on some important brain-racking business, had brought a letter of recommendation to our host, and our host had taken him under his protection. Not at all con amore. It was merely out of politeness that he had invited him to the children's ball. They did not play cards with him. They did not offer him cigars. No one entered into conversation with him. Possibly they recognized the bird by its feathers from a distance. Thus my gentleman, not knowing what to do with his hands, was compelled to spend the evening stroking his whiskers. His whiskers were really fine, but he stroked them so assiduously that one got the feeling that the whiskers had come into the world first, and afterwards the man, in order to stroke them. There was another guest who interested me, but he was of a quite different order. He was a personage. They called him Julian Mastakovich. At first glance one could tell he was an honoured guest, and stood in the same relation to the host as the host to the gentleman of the whiskers. The host and hostess said no end of amiable things to him, were most attentive, whining him, hovering over him, bringing guests up to be introduced, but never leading him to anyone else. I noticed tears glisten in our host's eyes when Julian Mastakovich remarked that he had rarely spent such a pleasant evening. Somehow I began to feel uncomfortable in this personage's presence. So after amusing myself with the children, 5 of whom, remarkably well-fed young persons, were our hosts, I went into a little sitting-room, entirely unoccupied, and seated myself at the end that was a conservatory, and took up almost half the room. The children were charming. They absolutely refused to resemble their elders, notwithstanding the efforts of mothers and governesses. In a jiffy they had denuded the Christmas tree down to the very last sweet, and had already succeeded in breaking half of their playthings before they even found out which belonged to whom. One of them was a particularly handsome little lad, dark-eyed, curly-haired, who stubbornly persisted in aiming at me with his wooden gun. But the child that attracted the greatest attention was his sister, a girl of about 11, lovely as a cupid. She was quiet and thoughtful, with large, full, dreamy eyes. The children had somehow offended her, and she left them and walked into the same room that I had withdrawn into. There she seated herself with her doll in a corner. Her father was an immensely wealthy businessman, the guests informed each other in tones of awe. 300,000 roubles set aside for her dowry already. As I turned to look at the group from which I heard this news item issuing, my glance met Julian Mastakovich's. He stood listening to the insipid chatter in an attitude of concentrated attention, with his hands behind his back and his head inclined to one side. All the while I was quite lost in admiration of the shrewdness our host displayed in the dispensing of the gifts. The little maid of the many-rubied dowry received the handsome doll, and the rest of the gifts were graded in value according to the diminishing scale of the parent's station in life. The last child, a tiny chap of 10, thin, red-haired, freckled, came into possession of a small book of nature stories without illustrations, or even head and tail pieces. He was the governess's child. She was a poor widow, and her little boy, clad in a sorry-looking little nankeen jacket, looked thoroughly crushed and intimidated. He took the book of nature stories and circled slowly about the children's toys. He would have given anything to play with them, but he did not dare to. You could tell he already knew his place. I like to observe children. It is fascinating to watch the individuality in them struggling for self-assertion. I could see that the other children's things had tremendous charm for the red-haired boy, especially a toy theatre, in which he was so anxious to take a part that he resolved to fawn upon the other children. He smiled and began to play with them. His one and only apple he handed over to a puffy urchin whose pockets were already crammed with sweets, and he even carried another youngster pickaback, all simply that he might be allowed to stay with the theatre. But in a few moments an impudent young person fell on him and gave him a pummelling. He did not dare even to cry. The governess came and told him to leave off interfering with the other children's games, and he crept away to the same room the little girl and I were in. She let him sit down beside her, and the two set themselves to busily dressing the expensive doll. Almost half an hour passed, and I was nearly dozing off, as I sat there in the conservatory half listening to the chatter of the red-haired boy and the dowered beauty, when Julian Mastakovich entered suddenly. He had slipped out of the drawing-room under cover of a noisy scene among the children. From my secluded corner it had not escaped my notice that a few moments before he had been eagerly conversing with the rich girl's father, to whom he had only just been introduced. He stood still for a while, reflecting and mumbling to himself, as if counting something on his fingers. 300, 11, 12, 13, 16, in 5 years. Let's say 4%, 5 times 12, 60. And on these 60, let us assume that in 5 years it will amount to, well, 400. But the shrewd old fox isn't likely to be satisfied with 4%. He gets 8 or even 10 perhaps. Let's suppose 500, 500,000 at least, that's sure. Anything above that for pocket money. He blew his nose and was about to leave the room when he spied the girl and stood still. I, behind the plants, escaped his notice. He seemed to me to be quivering with excitement. It must have been his calculations that upset him so. He rubbed his hands and danced from place to place and kept getting more and more excited. Finally, however, he conquered his emotions and came to a standstill. He cast a determined look at the future bride and wanted to move toward her, but glanced about first. Then, as if with a guilty conscience, he stepped over to the child on tiptoe, smiling, and bent down and kissed her head. His coming was so unexpected that she uttered a shriek of alarm. "What are you doing here, dear child?" he whispered, looking around and pinching her cheek. "We're playing." "What, with him?" said Julian Mastakovich, with a look askance at the governess's child. "You should go into the drawing-room, my lad," he said to him. The boy remained silent and looked up at the man with wide-open eyes. Julian Mastakovich glanced round again cautiously and bent down over the girl. What have you got? A doll, my dear?" "Yes, sir." The child quailed a little, and her brow wrinkled. "A doll! And do you know, my dear, what dolls are made of?" "No, sir," she said weakly, and lowered her head. "Out of rags, my dear." "You, boy, go back to the drawing-room, to the children," said Julian Mastakovich, looking at the boy sternly. The two children frowned. They caught hold of each other and would not part. "And do you know why they gave you the doll?" asked Julian Mastakovich, dropping his voice lower and lower. "No." "Because you were a good, very good little girl the whole week." Saying which, Julian Mastakovich was seized with a paroxysm of agitation. He looked round and said in a tone faint, almost inaudible, with excitement and impatience, "If I come to visit your parents, will you love me, my dear?" He tried to kiss the sweet little creature, but the red-haired boy saw that she was on the verge of tears, and he caught her hand and sobbed out loud in sympathy. That enraged the man. "Go away! Go away! Go back to the other room, to your playmates." "I don't want him to! I don't want him to! You go away!" cried the girl. "Let him alone! Let him alone!" She was almost weeping. There was a sound of footsteps in the doorway. Julian Mastakovich started and straightened up his respectable body. The red-haired boy was even more alarmed. He let go the girl's hand, sidled along the wall, and escaped through the drawing-room into the dining-room. Not to attract attention, Julian Mastakovich also made to the dining-room. He was red as a lobster. The sight of himself in a mirror seemed to embarrass him. Presumably he was annoyed at his own ardour and impatience. Without due respect to his importance and dignity, his calculations had lured and pricked him to the greedy eagerness of a boy who makes straight for his object. Though this was not as yet an object, it only would be so in 5 years' time. I followed the worthy man into the dining-room, where I witnessed a remarkable play. Julian Mastakovich, all flushed with vexation, venom in his look, began to threaten the red-haired boy. The red-haired boy retreated farther and farther until there was no place left for him to retreat to, and he did not know where to turn in his fright. "Get out of here! What are you doing here? Get out, I say, you good-for-nothing! Stealing fruit, are you? Oh, so stealing fruit. Get out, you freckle-face! Go to your likes!" The frightened child, as a last desperate resort, crawled quickly under the table. His persecutor, completely infuriated, pulled out his large linen handkerchief and used it as a lash to drive the boy out of his position. Here I must remark that Julian Mastakovich was a somewhat corpulent man, heavy, well-fed, puffy-cheeked, with a paunch and ankles as round as nuts. He perspired and puffed and panted. So strong was his dislike, or was it jealousy, of the child that he actually began to carry on like a madman. I laughed heartily. Julian Mastakovich turned. He was utterly confused and for a moment apparently quite oblivious of his immense importance. At that moment our host appeared in the doorway opposite. The boy crawled out from under the table and wiped his knees and elbows. Julian Mastakovich hastened to carry his handkerchief, which he had been dangling by the corner, to his nose. Our host looked at the three of us rather suspiciously, but like a man who knows the world and can readily adjust himself, he seized upon the opportunity to lay hold of his very valuable guest and get what he wanted out of him. "Here's the boy I was talking to you about," he said, indicating the red-haired child. "I took the liberty of presuming on your goodness in his behalf." "Oh," replied Julian Mastakovich, still not quite master of himself. "He's my governess's son," our host continued in a beseeching tone. "She's a poor creature, the widow of an honest official. That's why, if it were possible for you—" "Impossible, impossible!" Julian Mastakovich cried hastily. "You must excuse me, Philip Alexeyevich. I really cannot. I've made inquiries. There are no vacancies, and there is a waiting list of 10 who have a greater right. I'm sorry." "Too bad," said our host. "He's a quiet, unobtrusive child." "A very naughty little rascal, I should say," said Julian Mastakovich wryly. "Go away, boy. Why are you here still? Be off with you to the other children." Unable to control himself, he gave me a sidelong glance, nor could I control myself. I laughed straight in his face. He turned away and asked our host, in tones quite audible to me, who that odd young fellow was. They whispered to each other and left the room, disregarding me. I shook with laughter. Then I too went to the drawing-room. There the great man, already surmounted by the fathers and mothers and the host and the hostess, had begun to talk eagerly with a lady to whom he had just been introduced. The lady held a rich little girl's hand. Julian Mastakovich went into fulsome praise of her. He waxed ecstatic over the dear child's beauty, her talents, her grace, her excellent breeding, plainly laying himself out to flatter the mother, who listened scarcely able to restrain tears of joy, while the father showed his delight by a gratified smile. The joy was contagious. Everybody shared in it. Even the children were obliged to stop playing so as not to disturb the conversation. The atmosphere was surcharged with awe. I heard the mother of the important little girl, touched to her profoundest depths, ask Julian Mastakovich, in the choicest language of courtesy, whether he would honour them by coming to see them. I heard Julian Mastakovich accept the invitation with unfeigned enthusiasm. Then the guests scattered decorously to different parts of the room, and I heard them, with veneration in their tones, extol the businessman, the businessman's wife, the businessman's daughter, and especially Julian Mastakovich. "Is he married?" I asked out loud of an acquaintance of mine standing beside Julian Mastakovich. Julian Mastakovich gave me a venomous look. "No," answered my acquaintance, profoundly shocked by my intentional indiscretion. Not long ago I passed the church of... I was struck by the concourse of people gathered there to witness a wedding. It was a dreary day. A drizzling rain was beginning to come down. I made my way through the throng into the church. The bridegroom was a round, well-fed, pot-bellied little man, very much dressed up. He ran and fussed about and gave orders and arranged things. Finally the word was passed that the bride was coming. I pushed through the crowd, and I beheld a marvellous beauty whose first spring was scarcely commencing. But the beauty was pale and sad. She looked distracted. It seemed to me even that her eyes were red from recent weeping. The classic severity of every line of her face imparted a peculiar significance and solemnity to her beauty. But through that severity and solemnity, through the sadness, shone the innocence of a child. There was something inexpressibly naive, unsettled, and young in her features, which, without words, seemed to plead for mercy. They said she was just 16 years old. I looked at the bridegroom carefully. Suddenly I recognized Julian Mastakovich, whom I had not seen again in all those 5 years. Then I looked at the bride again. Good God! I made my way as quickly as I could out of the church. I heard gossiping in the crowd about the bride's wealth, about her dowry of 500,000 roubles. So and so much for pocket money. Then his calculations were correct, I thought, as I pressed out into the street. End of The Christmas Tree and the Wedding by Fyodor M. Dostoevsky. Recording by Peter Tomlinson.
The Death of Pan, from 51 Tales by Lord Dunsany. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. The Death of Pan, from 51 Tales by Lord Dunsany. When the travelers from London entered Arcady, they lamented one to another the death of Pan. And anon they saw him lying stiff and still. Horned Pan was still, and the dew was on his fur. He had not the look of a live animal. And then they said, "It is true that Pan is dead." And standing melancholy by the huge prone body, they looked for long at memorable Pan. And evening came, and a small star appeared. And presently, from a hamlet of some Arcadian valley, with a sound of idle song, Arcadian maidens came. And when they saw there, suddenly in the twilight, that old recumbent god, they stopped in their running and whispered among themselves. "How silly he looks," they said, and thereat they laughed a little. And at the sound of their laughter, Pan leapt up, and the gravel flew from his hoofs. And for as long as the travelers stood and listened, the crags and hilltops of Arcady rang with the sounds of pursuit. End of The Death of Pan by Lord Dunsany.
Dialogue between the spirits of a poet and a drunkard by John Dunton, 1659 to 1733. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Drunkard. Well met, brother. Which way is your flight designed? Poet. I have just left the bosom of causes to take a prospect of the lower world, to see if there be any preparation for my reception there. And yet I'm much troubled at the apprehension of being clogged with the uneasy, restless lump of humanity, and the attending consequences make me very impatient. Drunkard. Why so? What conjectures have ye? Poet. 'Tis the want of reasonable conjectures, for by all the observations I can make of my temper, I cannot resolve myself whether I am a male or a female spirit. But why do I thus busy myself about sexes? Certainly 'tis ominous, and argues my embodying near at hand. But if, after 6,000 years' expectation, I should be tied to a poet, I shall reckon it a forestalling my damnation, and had e'en as good commence devil, without any more ado, and take up with one hell. See you not that wretch in yonder grove, with his hat over his eyes, scratching his head, tearing his nails, and sending his poor hackneyed soul about like a spaniel dog to fetch and carry similitudes, rhymes, composition, fiction, etc.? I remember about 30 years since, when he was our companion, he would sometimes break off in the middle of a discourse without bidding good-bye, and away to the brooks, groves, and fountains, which made me suspect the nearness of a poetic preferment. But hark, the humour of our late companion in his new lodging. When formless and inanimate I lay, sleeping in chaos with my fellow clay, or those teeming particles had met, to make this wretched composition so complete, without my knowledge or concurrence, thou biddest me awake and live. Well, what then? Why, the sense is out before the rhyme. Now 'twould be charitable to assume an airy organ, and help him out, namely, I know not how. Poor wretch! He knows not what to do, unless he undoes all, and begins again, which he'd as lieve be hanged as attempt, having taken so much pains about it already. Oh, but for Sisyphus' restless stone, or Michaelides' leaking tun, they are minute and petite tasks to his. Not Ixion's wheel has half the torture of an over-hasty period. But this is not all. When he has undergone the bitter throes and pains of rhymeship, then the darling offspring of his brain turns prostitute to the abuses of all the world. The praises of wise men are so few that their voice is lost in so large a theatre, and numerous applauses of fools are too loud a scandal. And after all this, 'tis not pity the poor rogue should take such pains to be damned. For there's not one poet in 5,000 that escapes. It had gone hard with Oldham himself, if it had not been for the penance of his own satyrs. Say, fellow Immateriality, what shall I do? I can never look down upon a couple of lovers, but I'm afraid their toying will end in making an Halcyonian prison for me, especially if the inamorato is for balls, masquerading, and love sonnets. Drunkard. Alas, brother, I'm all resentment and pity. Little do mortals think what plague we are at, about the lodging and entertainment we expect at their hands. But for my part, your apprehensions of incorporation are all charms and sweetness to the dismal reception I look for. Poet. Why, what's the matter with you? Drunkard. I can never leave our happier regions to visit the lower elements, but before I am aware, I find myself amongst sea fowl, hovering over rivers, ponds, and marshes, admiring the scaly shoals, and envying the pastime of those ever thrifty revellers. Now what can this mean, but that I'm ordained to actuate a drunkard? And if so, hell is a toy to such a confinement. This moment would I plunge into the boundless depths to be secured from such a companion. But why that rash thought? Is not hell also crowded with them? And are not its horrors doubled by their concession? Yet, if hell could be hell without 'em, 'twould be a happy place, and nothing in it of the beast, antic, or nonsense, but a rational complaint of despair. Wonder not, dear brother, at my deeper reflections, till you've considered yonder figure at the old D Tavern. What think you of their motions, converse, and passions? Suppose all their discourse were taken in shorthand, and the weakest person amongst 'em should have a view of the whole when he's in a mood of thinking. Would not he blush at such follies, at such an unaccountable expense of time, especially if he thought an hour so spent was of equal length with any other hour in the line of life, and must be equally accounted for? Alas! Who would suppose that souls cloistered up in these sensualized, unthinking statues were ever our companions? Come, let's retire towards our peaceful regions, and be not witnesses of what a midnight scene produces. A poet's structure, a fade of a poetic mansion. 'Tis a paradise, to what I dread. Nor is there any spirit in all our order that can be afraid of such a body, but I must meet with it in this epitome of all plagues. A drunkard can be poet, beggar, cully, buffoon, or anything, so that I'm like to meet with the most abject slavery in nature. End of Dialogue between the Spirits of a Poet and a Drunkard, by John Dunton, 1659 to 1733.
The Dog and the Bees by Ambrose Bierce. From Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. The Dog and the Bees by Ambrose Bierce. A dog, being very much annoyed by bees, ran quite accidentally into an empty barrel lying on the ground, and looking out of the bunghole, addressed his tormentors thus: "Had you been temperate, stinging me only one at a time, you might have got a good deal of fun out of me. As it is, you have driven me into a secure retreat, for I can snap you up as fast as you can come in through the bunghole. Learn from this folly of intemperate zeal." When he had concluded, he awaited a reply. There wasn't any reply, for the bees had never gone near the bunghole. They went in the same way as he did, and made it very warm for him. The lesson of this fable is that one cannot stick to his pure reason when quarreling with bees. The end of The Dog and the Bees by Ambrose Bierce. A Haunted House from Monday or Tuesday by Virginia Woolf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. A Haunted House by Virginia Woolf. Whatever hour you woke, there was a door shutting. From room to room they went, hand in hand, lifting here, opening there, making sure. A ghostly couple. "Here we left it," she said. And he'd added, "Oh, but there too." "It's upstairs," she murmured. "And in the garden," he whispered. "Quietly," they say, "or we shall wake them." But it wasn't that you woke us. Oh, no. They're looking for it. They're drawing the curtains, one might say. And so read on a page or two. Now they've found it, one would be certain, stopping the pencil on the margin. And then, tired of reading, one might rise and see for oneself. The house all empty, the doors standing open, only the wood pigeons burbling with content, and the hum of the threshing machine sounding from the farm. What did I come in here for? What did I want to find? My hands were empty. Perhaps it's upstairs then. The apples were in the loft. And so down again. The garden still as ever, only the book had slipped into the grass. But they had found it in the drawing room. Not that one could see them. The window panes reflected apples, reflected roses. All the leaves were green in the grass. If they moved in the drawing room, the apple only turned its yellow side. Yet, the moment after, if the door was opened, spread upon the floor, hung upon the walls, pendant from the ceilings, what? My hands were empty. The shadow of a thrush crossed the carpet. From the deepest wells of silence, the wood pigeon drew its burble of sound. Safe, safe, safe. The pulse of the house beat softly. The treasure buried. The room. The pulse stopped short. Oh, was that the buried treasure? A moment later, the light had faded. Out in the garden, then. But the trees spun darkness for a wandering beam of sun. So fine, so rare, coolly sunken beneath the surface, the beam I sought always burnt behind the glass. Death was the glass. Death was between us. Coming to the woman first, hundreds of years ago, leaving the house, sealing all the windows. The rooms were darkened. He left it, left her, went north, went east, saw the stars turning in the southern sky, sought the house, found it dropped beneath the downs. Safe, safe, safe. The pulse of the house beat gladly. The treasure is yours. The wind roars up the avenue. Trees stoop and bend this way and that. Moonbeams splash and spill wildly in the rain. But the beam of the lamp falls straight from the window. The candle burns stiff and still, wandering through the house, opening the windows, whispering not to wake us. The ghostly couple seek their joy. "Here we slept," she said, and he adds, "Kisses without number. Waking in the morning. Silver between the trees. Upstairs, in the garden. When summer came, in winter snow time. The doors go shutting far in the distance, gently knocking like the pulse of a heart. Nearer they come, cease at the doorway. The wind falls. The rain slides silver down the glass. Our eyes darken. We hear no steps beside us. We see no lady spread her ghostly cloak. His hands shield the lantern. Look, he breathed. Sound asleep. Love upon their lips. Stooping, holding their silver lamp above us, long they look, and deeply. Long they pause. The wind drives straightly. The flame stoops slightly. Wild beams of moonlight cross both floor and wall, and, meeting, stain the faces bent, the faces pondering, the faces that search the sleepers and seek their hidden joy. Safe, safe, safe. The heart of the house beats proudly. Long years, he sighs. Again you found me. Here, she murmurs, sleeping, in the garden reading, laughing, rolling apples in the loft. Here we left our treasure. Stooping, their light lifts the lids upon my eyes. Safe, safe, safe. The pulse of the house beats wildly. Waking, I cry, "Oh, is this your buried treasure? The light in the heart?" The end of A Haunted House by Virginia Woolf.
Honk, honk. Shorty McCabe at the Wheel by Sewell Ford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information at the volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1. Say, I've got it all right. No, not the maiden Germany measles or the pip, but something most as common. More'n that, I'm glad of it. All that bothers me now is just when it was I swallowed the bug. The best I can do is to trace it all back to that combination of Zenas and Mr. Tidwell. The only line you need on Zenas is that he was a bacon-tinted gent from the West Indies that Sadie hired by the month to run her car. Excuse me if I don't dwell on Zenas. Sadie's managed to pick some mighty punk specimens of the Shufford tribe first and last, and we've had our troubles with them. But this St. Thomas Island party with the breakfast meat complexion had more curly black hair on his head and less gray matter underneath the skull than any two-legged article of his size I ever saw outside of a cage. Add to that a lazy streak that was bone deep and a chronic case of sulks, and maybe you won't wonder why Zenas didn't hold his job longer. What got me so grouchy on him, though, was because we didn't even have the satisfaction of firing him. About once a week regular, we threatened to tie the can to Zenas, and it was a pleasure I was kind of saving up and looking forward to. And then one day, just as Sadie was ready to make a train for town, having notified Mr. Zenas an hour before, up comes word that he's quit. Mother Whaley brings in the bulletin. "What's that?" says Sadie. "Why didn't he say so when I paid him this morning?" "Why, the "Never mind thinking up any fancy pet names, Sadie," says I. "You couldn't do the subject justice. Just wait until I go out there and unlimber a few of the bottled up remarks I've been keeping in so long." But Zenas has counted on that, and all there is left to remind us of him is an old cap and some empty cigarette boxes. And there's the big limousine standing there just waiting for someone that knew how to touch her off. Also, the train was due in 6 minutes. Sadie's followed me out to remind me of that. "It's a pity you can't run a car, Shorty," says she. "Yes, or play the zither, or walk a slack wire," says I, "and think how handy I'd be around the house if I added practical plumbing and shoe cobbling to my other accomplishments." Oh, I passed it off light and easy enough, and we phones for a depot hack to take her to the next train. But somehow the remark sort of lingered. It didn't worry me so much at the time, but every now and then it would bob up and I'd think it over. 2. Then a few mornings later, as I was piking down to the station, I hears this small-sized riot going on in the front yard of Mr. Tidwell, a neighbor that has the cute little stucco cottage 4 houses down the road from us. Course, I hangs up along the hedge and gawps over to see what's going on. And there's Tidwell, planted behind the steering wheel of a brand new shiny touring car, just out of the shop. First off, I thought he was trying to yank the steering post out by the roots. But then I sees he's trying to turn the thing around in the driveway without climbing the shade trees or damaging the shrubbery. He seems to have plenty of help, for Mrs. Tidwell and the 2 maids and the Italian who cuts his grass was all strung out around the lawn shouting at him, each one offering a different piece of advice as to what he ought to do next. "Back up some more, lovely," sings out Mrs. Tidwell, waving her arms. "Plenty of room ahead to the right, sir," hollers one of the maids. Well, I had to grin. You would, too, if you'd seen the desperate look on Tidwell's face as he grips that wheel and stares from one to the other. He's one of these thin, washed-out, soft-spoken, spectacled gents, Tidwell is. He's the lace expert for some big department store, so Sadie says, and he looks about as well qualified for the job he's tackled as a speckled hen trying to hatch out a setting of kitchen alarm clocks. First, he fumbles with one of the side levers and gets the engine to going like a steamroll drill. Then he tries another, and the machine gives a lunge forward that almost butts one of the maids into the geranium bed. I watches this circus until I hears the 8:17 express whistle before breaking into a trot for the station. And the last glimpse I had of Tidwell, he was mixed up with a lawn swing and a lilac bush, and the Italian was trying to climb a tree. "I hear Tidwell has a car," says one of the commuters as I drops into the smoker. "He had, up to 3 minutes ago," says I, "but the prospects are that he'll finish the week with some scrap iron and a few splinters. Say, I'm coming home early to watch him perform." Honest, the thoughts of him kept me chuckling most of the day, and that afternoon on the back trip I speculated all the way out on what his place must be looking like by then. I walks up to the post road with my grin all set to spring, when all of a sudden I hears a horn honk behind me, and the next thing I know along sails Tidwell in his new car, bent a little forward with a stranglehold on the wheel and his eyes bugged out like a couple of peeled onions, but driving along at a 20-mile clip and keeping in the middle of the road. He's all alone, too. "Well, I'll be dipped in glue," says I, or words to that effect. Think of it. Tidwell. You know how you're apt to size up a man for a weak sister and suspect him of being one of the kind that lets his wife buy his neckties? Why, I hadn't credited Tidwell with having any more spine than a piece of pickled tripe, and as far as his having nerve enough to run an automobile all by himself, well, it was one on the plexus for me. Course, you see all sorts of people handling steering wheels, from 10-year-old kids up. But somehow I always looked on it as kind of a freak trick, like being able to walk on your hands or wiggling your ears. But Tidwell! And the funny anecdote about him I'd framed up to hand to Sadie was put on ice. I didn't even mention Tidwell. 3. Then, was it fate or just my feet that took me for a stroll up around Columbus Circle the next afternoon? Anyway, I forgot how I happened to stray so far uptown. All I know is I was walking around towards Broadway when I hears someone sing out, "Hey, shorty old sport!" And as I whirls around, up the curb glides a slick little red roadster, and I discovers Mr. Cecil Slattery shoving out the glad hand. "How are they coming?" says he. "In bunches, Slat," says I. "I expect you're getting them in carload lots as usual." "Yes, yes, brother," says he. "I'm one of the busy little honey gatherers, you know, and the world is my clover top." "Yes, I know," says I, "and the parties you light on generally get stung." "Haw, haw," says Cecil, letting it out free and joyful. That's him all the time, one of the smoothest, chirkiest, nerviest young gents that you can find along Gasoline Row, which is saying a good deal. 5 or 6 years ago, Slat was assistant wiper in one of these second-hand automobile garages, with grease on him from his red hair down to his run-over heels, and he knew just enough about machinery to chew the head off a nut with a Stilson wrench and wear a pair of overalls that would stand alone. He was cussed and kicked around by everyone in the place, but he kept on coming back with that impudent grin of his and monkeying with broken down old oil eaters, until he got so he knew the insides of different makes like the Tammany leader knows his wards. It wasn't until he was promoted to salesman, though, that Slat's talents got full swing. Why, he's admitted to me himself that he's booked more orders than any other 3 men on the row. And to see him now, in his college-cut clothes and his natty straw hat and his lemon-colored silk shirt with the turned-back cuffs, you'd never suspicion he used to wear my old sweaters. "What brand of speed destroyer is that you got there?" I says. "Is it another Triumph of the Century top-notcher, Niplu Ulster, eh?" "Well," says Slat, kind of hesitating, "it's a fine little car for the money, but I wouldn't want to say it was the best ever. I'd call it a good second, though." "What?" says I, gasping. "You in a machine that don't lay over anything that ever run on rubber? Are you joshin', or have you got paralysis of the tongue? Maybe, though, it belongs to somebody else." No, it was his machine, one he'd been using for a demonstrator all the spring, a present from the president of the company after he'd turned in his 101st order. But the fact of the matter was, he was changing firms. It seems he'd just signed a contract with another concern that put out a really high-grade, classy line, and although he wouldn't take on a new job until he came back from his little trip abroad, he'd already begun to hedge on his patter. "Of course," says Slat, "for a medium-price machine, this leads the list, and—" But right there he stops, and I notices his eyes narrow down thoughtful. "Say, Shorty," he goes on smooth as butter, "do you want to pick up this little beauty off the bargain counter?" "Ah, throw in your reverse," says I. "I'm no clover blossom, Slat. Besides, what would I do with it? Put it in the parlor?" "Why not use it to burn gasoline with?" says he. "Out of my line," says I. "I couldn't any more run the thing than a frog can fly." "You got hands and feet, haven't you?" says he. "Yes, but they ain't trying to do monkey stunts," says I. "Give 'em a course, then," says he. "No use, Slat," says I. "The machinery and juggling talents don't run in our family, and I takes it you've got to have a little of both to manipulate one of them hustle wagons. I couldn't learn in a month of wash days." "So?" says he. "Well, you just jump in here with me." "Said the spider to the fat bluebottle, eh?" I breaks in. "G'wan, you red-headed he-siren, you. Think you can yogi me into buying something I ain't got no more use for than a parrot has for tooth powder?" "Now that's all right, Shorty," says he, putting on an injured air. "You got a right to your suspicions, and they do me credit. But this is once where you're running down your signals." "Huh?" says I. "And then?" "Do you suppose for a moment," he goes on, "that I would try to unload anything on you that you didn't want? Why, you and I have known each other for—" There, Slat," says I. "Don't overwork the tear ducts. What might be this sudden spasm you're struggling with?" "Why," says he, looking sort of sad and crushed, "I simply want to show you where you're mistaken about having a subnormal intelligence. You say you can't learn to run a car. I'd like to prove that you can, that's all." Well, I ain't one to blight the happiness and peace of mind of a fella, being so careless and casual as all that. "Slat," says I, "cheer up. I'm going to give you a chance to do your worst." So with that, I climbs into the empty bucket seat beside him, and off we goes up the Riverside Drive. 4. As we hums along, swinging in and out of the trolley tracks, grazing a truck here and a streetcar there, Slat gives me a rapid-fire lecture on how it's done. Got me kind of interested, too, and before we strikes the Manhattan Viaduct, I had the whole program by heart. You know that new piece they've added to the drive up beyond 157th Street? We just got straightened out on that when he jams on his brake, fetches up with the engine still throbbing, and slides out from behind the wheel. "Here now," says he, "you do it." "Eh?" says I. "Me?" "You got a 50-foot roadway all to yourself," says he. "Why not try?" Honest, I was ashamed to let on how chilly my feet had gone all of a sudden, so I slips into his place and he takes mine. Now, let's see, says I, running over the directions out loud. You push forward on this side thingamabob, put your foot on that left pedal, and bring this handle back a few notches. As I said over the lesson, I went through the motions, and before I knew what was happening, the machine begins moving right under me. I chokes down a gasp, bugs my eyes out, and takes a death grip on that steering wheel. First we does a dive to the right, then a swoop to the left like a pink seagull with a jag on. Easy, easy, says Slat, kind of soothing. This is no serpentine course. Whirl it gently. And don't hold it so hard. It won't get away from you. Little more gas now. That's it. You're doing fine. Maybe I was, but every nerve and muscle in me was strung as tight as a piano wire. I'd always thought the drive had a good deal of width to it, but just then it looks as narrow as a footpath. Say, ain't there some 100-acre parade ground handy where I can finish this lesson? Says I. I don't want to mar the scenery any along here. Oh, you're all right, says Slat. Throttle low for this downgrade. Instead of throttling down, though, I must have throttled up, for we begins to shoot down that little hill as if we was on a roller coaster. But Slat reaches over and slows her up just in time to let me round a curve on two wheels. Now let's see you stop just beyond that tree, says he. What? Says I. Stop her, says he. You're gonna run over a man or into a wagon. Now stop! Say, we stopped all right. I grabbed all the levers I could at once and jammed down on all the foot pedals I could find. Oh, yes, we stopped. I come near keeping right on over the dash, but the wheel caught me in the breadbasket and set me back solid with my wind gone. Slat must have been looking for some such act, for he had his feet braced. Fine, says he, real sarcastic. Especially for the tires. You've killed your engine, too. The blame thing got what it deserved, then, says I. Crank up and try that again, says Slat. Only do it this time the way I told you. So I gets out and begins turning the front handle. Say, ever notice how easy most of them shuffers can whirl that thing? Well, I've got some little right-arm ginger myself, but I sure was red in the face by the time I'd given the crank 3 or 4 turns, and all that comes from the machine is kind of a low, hollow cough, like it was in the last stages. Perhaps you'd have better luck if you turned your spark first, says Slat, springing his grin on me. Ah, say, says I, what a humorous kid you are. But I pushes over the button, and with another turn I had her humming. Next time he told me to make the stop, I did it more careful. But at that I must have missed something, for just as we fetches up more or less gentle, the engine goes out of business again. What's your right foot doing on that pedal? Says Slat. I thought I told you 3 times how to. I know, says I. I got a brain like a cup custard. Ever have to put your tail down like that and own up what a thick thatch you've got? Honest, if I'd been a school kid being jacked up for forgetting his lesson, I couldn't have felt any cheaper. And nobody'll ever guess how much I wanted to quit the game. But I couldn't. If you know what to do, Slat goes on. Why the thunder don't you? It's this way, Slat, says I. My head knows it, but my feet don't. Not yet. I've got to educate 'em a little more. If you're willing to take the chances, though, I'm going to learn to run this blasted machine right here. If I don't, I'll buy it off you and burn it on the dump. That's the way to talk, says Slat. Get you mad up, and then you'll do it. 5. Well, sir, that's the right dope. I don't know how it come to me or when I passed the butterfingered stage, but I sets my teeth hard, puts my mighty intellect on the job, and inside of an hour I was doing the trick, running her along as straight as if she'd been on rails, slowing up, stopping, backing, and even turning around. All the way on the return trip down the drive, it was me held the wheel, and before we struck Broadway again, I was leaning back against the cushions in the cockiest style you could imagine. Now, I try to cut the chesty business, as a rule, but here I was at it, good and hard. Just the feeling of that steering wheel under my hands and seeing how tame I got all that machinery set me up so that I can almost feel my shirt getting tight across the front. It was great. I ain't had any such sensation since I was a youngster. Well, says Slat, as we gets back to Gasoline Row, it's too bad you're not in the market for a machine, for this one would fit you down to the ground. I don't say anything to that, but I hops out and walks around her, rubbing my hands over the polished gas lamps and poking at the tires and looking mighty wise. And the more I sized her up, the better she looked to me. Think I'm expert enough to run her out home this afternoon? Says I. Why, you could take her as far as Boston if you wanted to, says he. All you need now is practice. Of course, if you don't care to buy, I suppose I can. As a friend, Slat, says I, about how much more would you stand me up for than if I was a stranger? I knew I was a goner, so I thought I might as well show my hand. Maybe he stuck me and maybe he didn't. Anyway, I writes my check right there on the wheel, and after I'd had some oil and gasoline put in her and bought my license numbers, I starts for Rockhurst on the Sound. No use going into details about that trip. I knew the road fairly well, having gone over it in other bubbles, so I didn't get off the track. I had a few close shaves, but getting through 'em all right only made me chestier than ever. And all I could think of in the back of my nut was what a surprise party I was going to spring on Sadie when she sees me roll in all alone, handling the wheel myself. Say, I had that tableau mapped out 7 different ways across the board. First it was with Sadie discovered at the upper window, expecting to see me come hoofing it up the walk and waving joy signals to me with both arms. Then I had her on the veranda and almost falling backwards in a rocker at the sight. Maybe some of the neighbors would be there to help her throw a fit. The only times I had a chilly feeling along my spine was when the horrible thought struck me. What if she shouldn't be on hand at all and miss my grand entrance? 6. She was there, though. As I turned in through our front gates, I sees her out in the lawn, with little Sully in his perambulator. Honk, honk, says I, getting busy with the horn and speeding up a little extra. Why, Shorty, she squeals after one look. I just grins and locates the spot where I'd meant to take my grandstand finish and step out to receive the plaudits of the family. There's a little lattice-work summer house just to the left of the drive, and I'd framed it up that to stop just in front of that would make a good picture. All I did, too, was give one twist of my head and wave a hand at Sadie. But that was one frill too many. The next thing I knew, I'd made a swing to the left. I hears a great cracking and splintering of wood, and hanged if I don't find that I got a dinky summer house affair up on the radiator hood, with the machine making full tilt at a big maple tree less than a dozen feet away. Funny how quick things can happen in an automobile, ain't it? I had just sense enough left to jerk back the emergency brake and bring her up with one of the gas lamps barely grazing the bark. Then I shuts off the engine and begins to hear some of the things Sadie is shouting at me. "Why, what did you do that for, Shorty?" says she, running up. "That?" says I, pointing at the hood decoration. "Oh, just for practice." "Practice?" says she. "Sure," says I. "Thought that summer house might be a cute place to keep the machine in, but it don't quite fit, does it?" Course Sadie didn't let me get away with any such jolly as that, and the grand ovation I'd counted on somewhere missed fire. All she said was, when I explained how this was my own private machine, that I'd bought all by myself and meant to run back and forth from town in, "You better get someone to drive it for you, Shorty. Then it will last longer." "Huh, think so?" says I. "Well, see here, Sadie, I want you to understand that I'm going to handle that machine myself. Maybe there's a few stunts I ain't up on yet, but I'll get 'em if I have to burn up all the gasoline you could load on a lighter. Why, before I get through, I'm going to have that car so it'll stand on its hind legs and eat sugar out of my hand." No, I ain't quite reached that point yet, nor I ain't been pinched for busting the speed limit, and I haven't begun cutting notches on the cover of my coil box. But I've scorched my fingers on a hot sparking plug, and I've got pump blisters on my palms, so I guess I'm coming on. Anyway, I can look at Tidwell now without gritting my teeth. End of Honk Honk, Shorty McCabe at the Wheel by Sewell Ford. Recording by Scotty.
The Manuscript by Otto Larsen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Manuscript. Two gentlemen sat chatting together one evening. Their daily business was to occupy themselves with literature. At the present moment they were engaged in drinking whisky, an occupation both agreeable and useful, and in chatting about books, the theatre, women, and many other things. Finally they came around to that inexhaustible subject for conversation, the mysterious life of the soul, the hidden things, the unknown, that theme for which Shakespeare has given us an oft-quoted and oft-abused device, which one of the men, Mr. X, now used to point his remarks. Raising his glass, he looked at himself meditatively in a mirror opposite, and, in a good imitation of the manner of his favourite actor, he quoted, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in thy philosophy, Horatio." Mr. Weir arranged a fresh glass for himself, and answered, "I believe it. I believe also that it is given but to a few chosen ones to see these things. It never fell to my lot, I know. Fortunately for me, perhaps. For, at least so it appears to me, these chosen ones appear on closer investigation to be individuals of an abnormal condition of brain. As far as I personally am concerned, I know of nothing more strange than the usual logical and natural sequence of events on our globe. I confess things do sometimes happen outside of this orderly sequence, but for the cold-blooded and thoughtful person, the strange, the apparently inexplicable, usually turns out to be a sum of chance. That chance we will never be quite clever enough to fully take into our calculations. As an instance, I would like to tell you the story of what happened several years back to a friend of mine, a young French writer. He had a good, sincere mind, but he had also a strong leaning toward which was just then in danger of becoming as much of a fashion in France as it is here now. The event of which I am about to tell you threw him into what was almost a delirium, which came near to robbing him of his normal intelligence, and therefore came near to robbing French readers of a few excellent books. This is the way it happened. It was about 10 years back, and I was spending the spring and summer in Paris. I had a room with the family of a concierge on the left bank, Rue de Vaugirard, near the Luxembourg Gardens. A few steps from my modest domicile lived my friend Lucien F. We had become acquainted through a chain of circumstances which do not belong to this story. But these circumstances had made firm friends of us, a friendship which was a source of great pleasure and also of assistance to me in my study of Paris conditions. This friendship also enabled me to enjoy better and cheaper whisky than one can usually meet with in the city by the Seine, a really good Jameson Highland. Lucien F. had already published several books which had aroused attention through the oddity of their themes, and their gratifying success had made it possible for him to establish himself in a comfortably furnished bachelor apartment on the corner of the Rue de Vaugirard and the Rue de Conde. The apartment had a corridor and 3 rooms, a dining room, a bedroom, and a charming study with an enclosed balcony, the 3 windows of which, a large one in the centre and 2 smaller ones at the side, sent a flood of light in over the great writing table which filled nearly the entire balcony. Inside the room, near the balcony, stood a divan covered with a bearskin rug. Upon this divan I spent many of my hours in Paris, occupied in the smoking of my friend's excellent cigars, and the sampling of his superlatively good whisky. At the same time, I could lie staring up at the tops of the trees in the Luxembourg Gardens, while Lucien worked at his desk; for, unlike most writers, he could work best when he was not alone. If I remained away several days, he would invariably ring my bell early some morning, and drag me out of bed with the remark, "The whisky is ready. I can't write if you are not there." During the particular days of which I shall tell you, he was engaged in the writing of a fantastic novelette, The Force of the Wind, a work which interested him greatly, and which he would interrupt unwillingly at intervals to furnish copy for the well-known newspaper that numbered him among the members of its staff. His books were printed by the same house that did the printing for the paper. Often, as I lay in my favourite position on the divan, the bell would ring and we would be honoured by a visit from the printer's boy, Adolphe, a little fellow in a blue blouse, the true type of Paris gamin. Adolphe rejoiced in a broken nose, a pair of crafty eyes, and had his fists always full of manuscripts, which he treated with a carelessness that would have driven a literary novice to despair. Long rolls of yellow paper would hang out of his trousers pockets, as if ready to fall apart at his next movement, and the disrespectful manner in which he crammed my friend Lucien's scarcely dried essay into the breast of his blouse would have certainly called forth remarks from a journalist of more self-conceit. But his eyes were so full of sly cunning, and there was such an atmosphere of Paris about the stocky little 14-year-old chap, that we would often keep him longer with us, and treat him to a glass of anisette to hear his opinion of the writers whose work he handled. He was an amusing cross between a tricky little Paris gamin and a real child, and he hit off the characteristics of the various writers with as keen a touch of actuality as he could put into his stories of how many centimes he had won that morning at craps from his friend Pierre. Pierre was another employé of the printing house, Adolphe's comrade in his study of the mysteries of Paris streets, and now his rival. They were both in love with the same girl, the 15-year-old daughter of the keeper of La Prunelle Café, and her favour was often the prize of the morning's game. Now and then this rivalry between the two young Parisians would drop into a hand-to-hand fight. I myself was witness to such a skirmish one day, in front of La Prunelle. The rivals pulled each other's hair mightily, while the manuscripts flew about over the pavement, and Virginie, in her short skirts, stood at the door of the café and laughed until she seemed about to shake to pieces. Pierre was the strongest, and Adolphe came off with a bloody nose. He gathered up his manuscripts in grim silence, and left the battlefield, and the still laughing Virginie with an expression of deep anger on his wounded face. The following day, when I teased him a little because of his defeat, he smiled a sly smile and remarked, "Yes, but I won a franc from him, the big stupid animal. And so it was I, after all, who took Virginie out that evening. We went to the Café Néant, where I let them put me in the coffin and pretend to be decaying to amuse her. She thought it was lots of fun." One morning Lucien had come for me as usual, put me on the divan, and seated himself at his writing table. He was just putting the last words to his novel, and the table was entirely covered with the scattered leaves, closely written. I could just see his neck as he sat there, a thin sinewed expressive neck. He bent over his work, blind and deaf for anything else. I lay there and gazed over the tops of the trees in the park into the blue summer sky. The window on the left side of the desk stood wide open, for it was a warm and sultry day. I sipped my whisky slowly. The air was heavy, and thunder threatened in the distance. After a little while the clouds gathered together, heavy, low-hanging, copper-hued, real thunderclouds, and the trees in the park rustled softly. The air was stifling, and lay heavy as lead on my breast. "Lucien!" Lucien did not hear or see anything. His pen flew over the paper. I fell back lazily on my divan. Then, suddenly, there was a mighty tumult. A strong gust of wind swept through the street, bending the trees in the gardens quite out of my horizon. With a crash the right-hand window in the balcony flew wide open, and like a cyclone the wind swept through, clearing the table in an instant of all the loose sheets of paper that had lain scattered about it. "The devil! Why don't you shut the window?" I cried, springing up from the sofa. "Spare your energy. It's too late," said Lucien, with a gentle mockery in his soft voice. "Look there." He pointed out into the street, where his sheets of paper went swirling about in the heavy air like white doves. A second later came the rain, a veritable cloudburst. We shut the windows and gave ourselves up to melancholy thoughts about the lost manuscript, the recovery of which now seemed utterly hopeless. "That's 1,000 francs at least that the wind has robbed me of," sighed Lucien. "Well, enfin, that doesn't matter so much. But do you know anything more tiresome than to work over the same subject a second time? I can't think of doing it. It would fairly make me sick to try it." We were in a sad mood that morning. When we went out to breakfast at about 2:00, we looked about for some traces of the lost manuscript. There was nothing to be seen. It had vanished completely, whirled off to all four corners of the earth probably, this manuscript from which Lucien had expected so much. Truly it was the force of the wind. Now comes the strange part of the story. One morning, 2 weeks later, Lucien stood in the door of my little room, pale as a ghost. He had a bundle of printer's proofs in his hand, and held them out to me without a word. I looked at it and read: The Force of the Wind, by Lucien F. It was a good bundle of proofs, the entire first proofs of Lucien's novel, that novel the manuscript of which we had seen blown out of the balcony window and whirled away by the winds. "My dear man," I exclaimed, as I handed him back the proofs, "you have been industrious indeed, to write your entire novel over again in so short a time, and to have proofs already." Lucien did not answer. He stood silent, staring at me with a weird look in his otherwise so sensible eyes. After a moment he stammered: "I did not write the novel over again. I have not touched a pen since the day the manuscript blew out of the window." "Are you a sleep walker, Lucien?" "Why do you ask?" "Why, that would be the only natural explanation. They say we can do a great many things in sleep of which we know nothing when we wake. I've heard queer stories of that. Men have committed murders in their sleep. It happens quite often that sleep walkers write letters in a handwriting they do not recognize when awake." "I have never been a sleep walker," answered Lucien. "Oh, you can never tell," I remarked. "Would you rather explain it as magic, or as the work of fairies? Or do you believe in ghosts? Your muse has fascinated you, you mystic." And I laughed and trilled a line from the Mascot, which we had seen the evening before at the Lyric. But my merriment did not seem to strike an answering note in Lucien. He turned from me in silence, and with an offended expression took his hat and his proofs, and, humorist and sceptic as he was ordinarily, he parted from me with the words, uttered in a theatrical tone: "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in thy philosophy." He turned on his heel and left the room. To be candid, I was unpleasantly affected by the little scene. I could not for an instant doubt Lucien's honesty. He was so pale, so frightened almost, so touching in the alarm and excitement of his soul. Of course, the only explanation that I could see was that he had written his novel in a sleep walking state. for certainly no printer could set up type from a manuscript that did not exist, to say nothing of printing it and sending out proofs. Several days passed, but Lucien did not come near me. I went to his place once or twice, but the door was locked. Had the devil carried him off bodily, or had this strange and inexplicable occurrence robbed him of his sanity, and robbed me of his friendship and his excellent whisky? After 3 useless attempts to find him at home, and after writing him a letter which he did not answer, I gave up Lucien without any further attempt to understand his enigmatical behaviour. A short time after, I left my home without having seen or heard anything more of him. Months passed. I remained at home, and one evening when, during the course of a gay party, the conversation came around to the subject of mysticism and occult occurrences, I dished up my story of the enigmatical manuscript. The unknown, the occult, was the rage just then, and my story was received with great applause, and called forth numerous quotations as to more things in heaven and earth. I came to think so much of it myself that I wrote it out and sent it to Professor Flammarion, who was just then making a study of the unknown, which he preserved in his later book, L'Inconnu. The occupying myself with the story brought my mind around again to memories of Lucien. One day I saw a notice in Le Figaro to the effect that his book, The Force of the Wind, had appeared in a second large edition, and had aroused much attention, particularly in spiritualistic circles. I seemed to see him again before me, with his long nervous neck, which was so expressive. The vision of his neck rose up before me whenever I drank the same sort of whisky that I had drunk so often with him, and the longing to hear something more of my lost friend came over me. I sat down one evening, when in a sentimental mood, and wrote to him, asking him to tell me something of himself, and to send me his book. A week later I received the little book, and the following letter, which I have here in my pocket. It is somewhat crumpled, for I have read it several times, but no matter, I will read it to you now, if you will pardon my awkward translating of the French original. Here it is. Dear friend, many thanks for your letter. Here is the book. I have to thank you also that you did not lay my behaviour of your last days in Paris up against me. I must have seemed strange to you. I will try to explain it. I have been nervous from childhood. The fact that most of my books have treated of fantastic subjects, somewhat in the manner of Edgar Allan Poe, has made me more susceptible for all that world which lies beyond and about the world of everyday life. I have sought after, and yet feared, the mystical. Cool and lucid as I can be at times, I have always had an inclination for the enigmatical, the unknown. But the first thing that ever happened in my life that I could not explain or understand was the affair of the manuscript. You remember the day I stood in your room. I must have looked the picture of misery. The affair had played more havoc with my nerves than you can very well understand. Your mockery hurt me, and yet under all I felt ashamed of my own thoughts concerning this foolish occurrence. I could not explain the phenomenon, and I shivered at the things that it suggested to me. In this condition, which lasted several weeks, I could not bear to see you, or anyone else, and I was impolite enough even to leave your letter unanswered. The book appeared and made a hit, since that sort of thing was the centre of interest just then. But almost a month passed before I could rouse myself from that condition of fear and, I had almost said, softening of the brain, which prevented my enjoyment of my success. Then the explanation came. Thanks to this occurrence, I now know that I shall never again be in danger of being haunted. And I know now that chance can bring about stranger happenings than can be any fancied visitations from the spirit world. Here you have the story of this mystic occurrence, which came near endangering my sanity, and which turns out to be a chance combination of a gust of wind, a sudden downpour of rain, and the strange elements in the character of our little friend, Adolphe the printer's boy. You remember that funny little chap with the crafty eye, his talent for gambling, and his admiration for the girl of La Prunelle? A queer little mixture, this child, who has himself alone to look to for livelihood and care, the typical race of the Paris streets, the modified gamin from Les Miserables. About a month after the appearance of my book, I lay on the divan one day, your favourite place, you remember, and lost myself in idle reasonings on the same old subject that never left my mind day or night, when the bell rang and Adolphe appeared, to call for the essay on Le Boulevard. There was an unusual nervous gleam in his eyes that day. I gave him an anisette and tried to find out what his trouble was. I did find it out, and I found out a good deal more besides. Thanks to his good fortune as a gambler, Virginie came to look upon him with favour. Pierre was quite out of the race, and Adolphe's affection was reciprocated as much as his heart could desire. But with his good fortune in love came all the suffering, all the torture, the suspicions, that tear the hearts of us men when we set our hopes upon a woman's truth. Young as he was, he went through them all, and now he was torturing himself with the thought that she did not really love him, but was only pretending, while she gave her heart to another. Perhaps he was right. Why not? I talked to Adolphe as man to man, and managed to bring back a gleam of his usual jollity and sly humour. He took another glass of anisette, and said suddenly, "Monsieur Lucien, I did something." "Did what?" I asked. "Something I should have told you long ago. It was wrong, and you've always been so nice to me. You remember the day 2 months ago when we had such a sudden wind and rainstorm, a regular cloudburst. I was down here in this neighbourhood fetching manuscripts from Monsieur Labouchere and Monsieur Laroy. I was to have come up here for copy from you too, but then, you'll understand after all I've been telling you. I came around past La Prunelle, and Virginie stood in the doorway, and she'd promised to go out with me that evening. So I ran up to speak to her, and then when I went on again I saw a sheet with your writing lying in the street. You know all the gentlemen's writing, whose copy I fetch. Then I was frightened. I thought to myself, 'The devil,' I thought, 'here I've lost Monsieur Lucien's manuscript.' I couldn't remember calling for it, but I thought I must have done so before I got Monsieur Laroy's. I can't remember much except Virginie these days. I took up the sheet and saw 3 others a little further on, and I saw a lot more shining just behind the railing of the Luxembourg garden. You know how hard it rained. The water held the paper down, so the wind couldn't carry it any further. I ran into the garden and picked up all the sheets. 32 of them, all of them, except the first 4 I found in the street, had blown in behind the railing. And I can tell you I was precious glad that I had them all together. I ran back to the office, told them I had dropped the manuscript in the street, but asked them not to say anything to you about it. But the sheets were all there. You always number them so clearly, and handsome Auguste, the compositor, promised he wouldn't tell on me. I knew if the foreman heard of it, he'd put me out, for he had a grudge against me. So nobody knew anything about it. But I thought I ought to tell you, 'cause you've been so nice to me. Maybe you'll understand how one gets queer at times, when a girl like Virginie tells you she likes you better than Pierre, and yet you think she might deceive you for his sake, that big, stupid animal. But now I'll be going. Much obliged for your kindness, Monsieur Lucien, and for the anisette." And he left me. There you have the explanation, the very simple and natural explanation of the phenomenon that almost drove me crazy. The entire supernatural occurrence was caused by a careless boy's love affairs by a gust of south-west wind, by a sudden heavy rain, and by the chance that I had used English ink, the kind that water cannot blur. All these simple, natural things made me act so foolishly toward a good friend, the sort of friend I have always known you to be. Let me hear from you, and tell me what you people up north think of my book. I give you my word that the unknown powers shall never again make me foolish enough to risk losing your friendship. Yours, Lucien. So this is my story. Yes, there are more things in heaven and earth, but the workings of chance are the strangest of all. And this whiskey is really very good. Here's to you. End of The Manuscript by Otto Larssen.